For this painting demonstration, I am going to be using Claude Monet's Sunset at San Giorgio. And once again, I've got my image on my computer so that I can be looking at it for reference, because no matter how well you remember what something looks like, you want to be looking at it, especially when you are doing a reproduction that is supposed to be obviously recognizable. Now, the first thing I'm going to be doing on this one is I'm going to work on the sky, because as usual, that is the area that is furthest back. The next thing I would be doing would be the water, and then these buildings and the reflections and these little buildings are the last things that I would do, simply because they're more of a silhouette. So I would want to make sure that things are a little bit drier, and then I would go into them and then keep going in layers. Because remember, everything will take more than one layer. So for this particular painting, I'm going to start once again with my wet on wet for the sky. So I'm going to just paint that sky area with some water. It's not quite as important on this one to do that, simply because the sky is very splotchy, and you can see dabs of color going from one to the next. But I find that it is still helpful so that those transitions are as smooth as Monet made them. Remember, you're going to have more than one brush with you, so you can see some of these little areas between buildings that would need a smaller brush. It is okay to have more than one brush at a time, especially with watercolor, because they do tend to just need water to clean up, and the paint won't really dry on the brush and damage it the way that acrylic would. So watercolor is a much easier cleanup and classroom use type of paint, but not everybody understands how to use it, which is why I've got these demos to help you guys sort of figure out what you are doing. So I'm just painting my whole sky with water here, making sure that I go on both sides of that main building. And again, it's okay if you go over some of those lines a little bit, because you still will be able to see them, and you can always redraw them if you need to. So now I've got it painted with water. The first color that is in that sky is some red down here toward the bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in some red, get that started, let it kind of blend around and move where the water takes it. So right now we're still just kind of adjusting the red, letting it go directly to the edge of the silhouette here, and just moving it around. So your first couple layers with watercolor are on the quick side, simply because you want to be able to work on them simultaneously so that things stay wet. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and put in some yellow. Now on some of your palettes, your yellow will have other colors mixed in. All you have to do in order to get it back to yellow is use a good bit of water, mop it up, and get it wet. Then just get a paper towel and just kind of dab up whatever color was on top of the yellow, and then you'll have some nice clean yellow to use again. So then I'm just going to bring some of that clean yellow in here as soon as I'm able. Right now there's still a bit of blue on it, which turns it into a green, which I do not want in the sky. At this point, there is a little green above the yellow, but I need to get to a yellow first. So now I've got some yellow. Maybe it's just a smidge green still, but it's mostly yellow. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that directly above the red with a little gap in between the two, so that I can sort of sponge it a bit more as those layers start to dry. So you can see, since the red is still wet and there's still water there, the two are going to sort of blend together. So now what I'm going to do is get my brush a little bit drier, and I'm just going to sponge and just dab with it. It's not going to have much of that texture yet, that splotchy texture that we will eventually have, but what this is going to do is start to help to get those colors blending and dabbing from one to the next. Especially in the drier areas, like over here, where the paper has just had a little more time to dry, you'll see that sponging happening a little bit more already. The drier the paper gets, the more that texture will show. So here, because I have a big pool of water, it's not really showing up as the texture yet. So what I can do is take a paper towel and just mop up some of that extra water. And then it's going to be a little bit drier. Still not completely dry, but drier enough so that now I can actually use those colors a little bit more effectively. So as you can tell, the layering on this one is really what creates that texture. Right now, I'm just creating the color background almost. And then each layer that I do will use less and less water as I continue to sponge on top of this background. And then I'll get more of what I'm looking for. Just gonna mop that up a little more there. Sponge this a little more and bring some of that over here. See, now it's starting to get a little spongy there. So then the next thing I'm going to do while it is still pretty wet is go ahead and put my blue up here towards the top. Add a little more water to it. Because remember, this is still just my first layer, so there's still a lot of texture and a lot of buildup to do on this sky. But right now I've got all three colors. So now I'm just going to be sponging my yellow directly into the blue and vice versa, so that I can start to create the overall look that it has there. So again, you're going to be using a paper towel and kind of drying up your brush periodically, keeping it sort of clean. In other places, you'll be adding more color. But essentially what we're going to be doing now is sponge painting. Using a brush instead of a sponge. And we're just sort of creating that dot pattern. It's not quite pointillism, but it's pretty close. But we want to make sure that we leave some areas lighter, since there is some white in the sky too. And once again, this is just our first layer, so we probably will not get all of the color and all of the texture in there quite yet. We'll be building that up, as I said, in multiple layers, but we will eventually get there. So then the drier our brush is, you'll see that I start to make little white dots. Because what that dry brush is doing is picking up some of the paint that is there. So for this particular style, because it is a very sort of splotchy, dotty look, that's actually a good thing. So you can see that those dots are starting to happen now. There are a couple different ways to make these dots happen within a painting like this. There's this way, which is the way that I find most effective, but you can also paint all the colors and then sponge it up with a paper towel and leave sort of the wrinkles of the paper towel showing. And that would be another effective way to create this sort of a texture. I just prefer to use the paintbrush because it gives me a little bit more control over exactly where I put the lighter and the darker places. So there's a little more red on this side than in other places, so I'm just going to bring some of that red up a little higher into the sky, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off. Create some of those white spaces in between. Make some of the white spaces up in the blue area. And then the technique that I would be using on the water would be very, very similar, except instead of being quite so dabby and quite so polka dotty, for lack of a better word, it's going to be more like swoops. So instead of having it be as speckled as this is, and as speckled as we want this to be, for the water, I want it to be more like little lines to show the reflections and the ripples in the water. Whereas in the sky, we want it to look a little cloudy and spongy. So that might be my first layer on the sky for this piece. And then I would be ready to start a layer on the water, which I would start the very same way. I would go wet into wet. So I'm going to get my water wet, paint my water with water basically. So you can see the water this time is a little bit colored just from the other paint having been in it, but that's okay. And once again, it's okay if you go over some of those pencil lines, especially in some of the reflections. The only place you don't want to go over your pencil lines, oops, I dripped. The only place that you don't want to go over your pencil lines is if there is a white highlight. Okay, so some of these little reflections and areas I'm going to avoid putting much paint because I know that they're supposed to be lighter than the area around it. Now there are ways, especially if we start with our first layer nice and light, like we will, there are still ways to make a highlight after the fact. But the best way to leave a highlight is just to make sure that you have the paper white. Now I'm not going to paint this very bottom part because it's pretty light. So now I would be ready to go in, and once again there's some red here. It's a bit of a yellowier red, so I'm going to put a little yellow in from the beginning. So you can see them just kind of mixing directly onto the paper. With watercolor, that's okay. And you can see that wherever I have the water, it's going to continue to spread. So then it gets more to an orange as I get out here. You can see this area where the sky is kind of bleeding into the water. That's okay as well. It's not ideal on every single painting, but on this particular painting and paintings that have a similar background throughout, it's okay if a little bit of the parts of the background overlap. So then this side is eventually going to be really dark, but for now I'm just going to make sure that I get some color there. And then I'm going to spread this across more. Notice that I'm painting much more across and not so all over like I did on the sky. Because already we want to be able to start to tell the difference between the sky and the water. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that we make this water streaky in sort of a horizontal way. And I'm going to let it get down to white. I'm going to dry my brush off a bit. So that's starting to get to white down there towards the bottom. Notice I've not used any blue yet, even though I know that there is some blue in the water, because there's really not much. At the very bottom, there's a little bit, but it's lighter than that, so I'm going to go ahead and dry my brush off, and then I'm just going to spread that around. Again, still painting horizontally, and letting my dry brush kind of create some streaks there. Because then you can see that as I get to areas that are drying, the more I move that brush across, the more it's going to actually leave a little streak. So I'm going to dry my brush off again. Remember, each time I dry it off, that allows it to pick up more color. So I would keep doing this over and over a little bit until I feel like it's at a point where it's ready to dry before the next layer, And I feel like that's pretty close. So that might be my first layer on this particular painting.